All right, and we're live. Thank you for joining another session for the Next Generation Social Ledger here. This is Joachim Stroh from Brooklyn, New York. And we're going to talk about, again, the Human Organization deck and some of the additions I did and some of the expansions I added to the end. I think that changed the picture quite a lot, and I wanted to make sure that everybody is on board and see where we're taking this thing. So thanks for coming. Again, any questions you have in between, just let me know. We can pause at any time. It's not a formal event here, right? This is just going over the deck and giving you some updates and any questions, concerns, issues, ideas you have, of course. And feel free to jump in. Cool. Shall we start?
Cool.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Okay, let me share my screen. Jump to the deck. Everybody see the slide?
Gotcha.
No, I'm going to have to leave and come back in because I've changed my settings in Zoom and it's not rendering properly on my screen. Sorry.
Sure, yeah. We'll wait. Don't worry. Did anybody see the link that Philip posted? Let me see if I can find it. On a thing called Akasha, this one here.
I saw that, yes.
There's this blog thingy here. And where is their website? Oh no, this is something else. This is called Aragon. But this one here, the Akasha Project. Of course, file not found. That's good sign. Where is the Akasha world? Let me go to the home page. Oh, that's right. You can log in. I have to request to sign up for beta, which I did. I want to see more of the system. So to me, if you look at some of the screenshots they provide there and some of the presentations they gave, it's very much like Colony. I don't know if you've seen Colony. That's another platform that I'm trying to name that or label this. I'm calling this like a full service platform, full service stack. So they provide everything inside the platform. So it's like their own world building, right? So you join them, and inside this Akasha platform, you have everything you need, right? So they built their own chat system, they built their own currency thingy on top of Ethereum, and they have everything going on inside their platform. So in a way, I don't want to call it's a closed system, right? Because obviously they're not, thinking that way. But to me, it's like there's no way of adding other tools and processes and steps into that kind of platform because they define what it looks like, right? So they control sort of the whole development of that thing, which is an interesting approach to me, but shows me again that with the social ledger, I want to go in the other direction that says, yes, there's a platform, but it's sort of an open stack, right? So we get to decide, the users get to decide what kind of tools and ways working together they want to establish inside the platform. So I thought that was pretty interesting, that link. Okay, Gary, you're back. You can see everything?
Yes, thanks. It works now.
Excellent. Let's get started. Okay, cover slide. Notice I did something here with that little word "the," right? So I'm thinking, to sort of drop the notion of it's the human organization, and instead say it's about human organization. It's about organization in general more. And the reason why I'm thinking this is because the moment you put the "the" there, right, then you have an object, then you have something, right, that says this is the human organization. You know, this is the way forward. This is the way you guys got to join this, right? To me, this is not the intention of the deck, which is more about building bridges, right, between all of the different organizations that are out there, right? So I'm calling this at some point, it's a meta body that I create. So I don't want to even label it, you know, name it as some entity, right, that you have to join, right? Or some entity that at some point will take some control over some stuff, right? I want to be more generic here and say this is only about human organization in general, right? And this is ways of ways of getting organized and ways of creating these spaces, these safe spaces that we can work in, right? So that's an update on this slide here. So still not sure if I take it out or not, but I do want to emphasize that this is more about the meta level here. It's about human organization in general, not the thing that we're creating, you know, the new thing that's coming, because obviously everyone has an idea of how the future of work looks like and what the future organization looks like, right? But I don't want to take that path here with this deck. Rather say this is about how do we connect the existing organizations out there and bring them together into a fold that they can be participative, right? That they can take part in. Okay, here's a new slide, my star-lit sky here. This is a quote from the movie Contact, one of my favorite movies. The reason why I bring this up here is I want to emphasize that this is about connecting people, right? This is about bringing us together in these spaces, right? So we're sort of all of us are these little stars here, right? There's this bright star. This is Gary over here, right? Then there's Michael, that star over here, right? Shining. But sort of we're all sitting on these little islands somewhere, right? You know, it's our minds at work and thinking how the world behaves and what it tells us. But really the emphasis here of the social ledger is to say we want to bridge these gaps and see how can we, you know, make that emptiness that's out there, you know, a little bit more bearable. And by emptiness, I mean the individuals, the organizations, the people are sitting and trying to figure out things themselves, right? How can we bridge that gap a little bit with the social ledger? So that's one sort of title quote thingy. It's a typical American thing, right? So you always want to have one quote up front before you get into the substantive matter. That's my acknowledgement slide. You know, I put your names in there. If you're not comfortable with that, you know, feel free to take it out. So anybody who comes on board later, I will offer them, you know, just to put their name there. So they're part of this team here that we're putting out there and trying to get on this journey, right, together. Okay, that's a modification there. Let me jump to the next section, which was the body of people, right? So I introduced a few ways of how people can get organized. Sure.
Jochen,
Yeah.
I didn't see your name on that last slide.
No? Okay. Oh, you're right. I didn't.
Yeah, I think you know, truth in advertising, you know.
Okay. I'll
Put
add
it at
that.
the front.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
God. Right. So this was about the different bodies of people, right? So we talked about John Husband's hierarchy, Esko Kilpie's interconnected patterns, then Harold Jarkey's model that I brought up yesterday in our meeting in the Zoom session, right? The idea of the overlapping spaces between work teams, communities, and networks, right? Work teams being the ones that are most highly, you know, most structured and goal-oriented, and the networks that are most open and more community-driven. But here are two new bodies of you know, people that I added, and one of them is a friend of mine, is Ewan Semple. He has a great blog out there. You should try check him out. He is British too. No, he's Scottish actually. And he is also in the change organizations, change the way of working world. Great speaker, great person. and he was talking about something called Trojan mice, which was put out there by Peter Fryer years ago. But Ian picked it up and wrote more about it and brought it really into an organizational context, organizational design and building context. And what this is it's to his definition, it's a small, well-focused changes which are introduced on an ongoing basis, right, in a inconspicuous way, small enough to be understood and owned by all concerned, but the effects can be far-reaching. So it's the opposite of a Trojan horse, right? So you roll in this big thing into an organization, and it opens up and it conquers everything, and then this is the rollout, right? The typical thing you see in organizations. What Trojan mice are much smaller pieces of changes in technology, processes, team building, that are spread, across multiple places in the organization, and then adopted, adapted, and then being brought to life in these multifaceted, spaces and teams. And that to me is an interesting aspect, because that's very similar now to the social ledger that tries to introduce, small changes here and there, well focused, right? So we're saying, here's a good process, here's a good tool, here's a good way of working this out. And it's small enough, right? So it's not a big thing that we're rolling out. It's not a whole platform thing that then can be adopted and then used, at their own disposal, however they want to use the kind of tool set. So I thought that was interesting. The other thing, this is John Kelton's stuff. Oh, by the way, I'm starting to review that now with a couple of other folks. So I'm starting with John Kelton and Ron Srogan, and see what their input is on this deck here, and maybe bring them on board too at this stage or at a later stage. Because right now I think we're going into a development phase. So spend some time in development, but then we're getting into sort of a prototyping, testing stage pretty soon. And that's where we're going to bring in more people and see how they can connect this platform now to their initiatives, right? So, for example, John is looking at sense-making spaces and investigative journalism, see if he can make sense out of this and bring people into that space from his end. So here's another person. Her name is Bonita Roy. We actually had discussed her at Dig Live a while back. So I encourage you to look at her work. Very interesting. She has created something called the OPO, an open participatory organization, which to me aligns very well, again, with sociocratic principles and the way I want to bring some of these elements into this work. And one aspect of her work, and it's really, elaborate her work. And one aspect is her thinking around organizational architecture as a template, right? So a template that, you can take this and you can get started right away with that kind of template. And it's still good enough, to provide the features you need and then also allow you to customize this template. So that aspect is, again, very interesting for the social ledger, because I do want to bring in, a lot of this templatized, bootstrapping work that so many people have done out there, that can even start with organizational forms, the stuff that you see from John Hasbin or Hal Jarkey, right? Thinking in terms of, hey, this is how you group bodies of people, bring them together. How can we create a template around that and say, hey, here's one that you can take and you get started right away and see how that helps your team to build out a path. So another good person, Bonita Roy, encourage you to take a look at her work. All right, so moving on. Metabody. Yes, this is where I started to introduce, the concept of trees here. And I want to show you a new slide around that a little later. This is the metabody. This is then introducing the social ledger. This is introducing the bridges between, right? So between the bodies of people and bodies of work, where you have multiple now, aligned, and then trying to bridge this. filling in the gaps of there are a lot of profiles, a lot of actions, activities happening on both sides, and some of this is recorded in the social ledger. As Jim wants to emphasize all the time, it's your data, and if we do that together, it's our data, right? So that's an important point for the social ledger. You have control over your data, but it's part of a larger ecosystem that we're building here that becomes our data. And again, not part of some super organization, right? Super organism on top of that. It's not. It's really you're part of this network as an equal player, as a participant here, and you share what you want in this network. Here's a new slide that talks about the sort of the movement, or the acceleration, as I call it here, from idea to production, right? So you have an idea, and you will eventually lead that into some kind of a production mode, right? Could be a product, could be service, whatever, right? And the way these things usually play out is initially in your idea stage, you naturally have a lot of interactions, right? So you bring in a couple of folks, you start talking about this idea, but you're far away from moving that into something that's in production mode, right? And that's where I call the other side of things here the transactions. So as interactions become more and more transaction oriented, you move this thing towards production. And you can see this is actually a timeline here. So you would say you start over here with only interactions, and at some point interactions, some of them will turn into transactions, right? So, and by transaction, I mean, it doesn't have to be a financial transaction, right? It can be a transaction in terms of, hey, there's a new role here and I want you to be in that role. We have to, maintain certain server side aspects. You want to sign up for this role or not, right? And the role of the social ledger here again is to say, hey, this is a vehicle here for you and your team to speed through this process a bit faster, right? So you go from idea to production, or as I call it here, from thought to finish, from co-creations. So these interactions are really a co-creative space here, to what I call co-offerings here. So these transactions aligned with a co-offering notion. That means you're not working on this alone. This is again not in isolation. This is with your team together, putting something together and building something together. So this is to me a picture that shows sort of. So here's something that we can use, as a vehicle to say you want to move from this side to this side. That's good. If you want to move slow, that's good. If you want to move fast, maybe there's some templates that we can provide to move you faster into a production mode, right? Or maybe if you want to just anchor yourself in the center here and say, well, we don't want to really go to all the way to the production side, right? It's a good space to have some interactions, and we don't need to move that far out on this curve. Okay, that's one picture I added, and another one is this one here. Let me make this bigger. So this is me thinking about breaking down these information silos. One of the themes I was working on over the last years and years was facing these silos, corporate silos, organizations that don't share information and sit on their knowledge, people who sit on their knowledge, and unwilling to share that with the rest of the organization. Now, bringing this into our social ledger context, what would that mean? So, you see, here are these silos of knowledge again, 4 of them pictured. But the thing is, a part of the silo can be connected to what I call the shared knowledge piece here. So within the silo, there may be people, there may be processes, there may be technologies that people can tap into and say, that's the part we want to break out of our silo, right? And that's the part that can be connected to the social ledger, right? And to me, there's actually a good side to the silo thing. It's not all negative, Because to me, if you have a silo, then there's also a very focused, concentrated space where thinking, where action happens, right? Among people who are comfortable sitting in this secure space, right? So I can see how this actually can play together. So between the parts that are sitting in the silo, that maybe even are, not open to everyone, that should be rather confidential. They don't want to share this information. And the part that is open, that is sort of the explorative part, that they do want to go out there and say, hey, let's see what other people are thinking about this. And to me, this could be a role of the social ledger to sort of tap into these silos and say, here's a common platform you bring in, and then you start sharing this information, right? Now, immediately, I think what comes to mind here is well, people have done this already. There are companies like Yammer who did exactly that, right? They saw that there are silos everywhere, and they created a platform to say, hey, here's Yammer, break out of the silo. Here it is. Work around your IT department, and we can give you the tools, and you don't have to deal with this crap at your organization anymore, right? Well, but you think further, what Yammer did is actually they created new silos because they didn't think there's a common social ledger layer here. They were thinking, okay, there's a shared part. We give them this shared part, but they still, sit inside their organization or their group or their unit. But it's a shared part. This is different from the social ledger, right? Where I'm thinking this is not only do we tap into the shared part of knowledge, but also the ability to share the entire space with other groups here that are participating in this. And since this is a distributed architecture, this can be anywhere, right? So anybody who is willing to join from one of the silos tapping into the social ledger suddenly has access to the rest of the knowledge that's being shared in the social ledger, right? Not saying everything is shared in the social ledger. You can still operate sort of on your own personal, group level and private level, and not sharing the knowledge, which is okay. Maybe you want to get more comfortable with this kind of technology space and so forth. So it takes time for you to adjust to this kind of new environment. But once you do, it's there. We're there, right? So the social ledger is there. It opens up the channels, and you can connect and reach out to other folks who are participating, who are actually the beneficiaries here. If you look at this bottom here, sorry about this noise. This is New York, folks, right? Live from New York. If you look at the beneficiaries down here, so there are employees that will benefit from this. There are members, if you're more in a loosely organized group or cooperatives, there are members who benefit from this. And more importantly, there are open source system developers, right, who will benefit from that. Why? Because we're sort of attaching and bringing in their tool set into the social ledger space, right? This is not building a new tool from scratch. This is connecting and bridging and linking to the existing technology that is out there. Hey there. Thanks for joining, Rob.
Hey, Joachim. Jim and I were in another meeting, and I just didn't realize. So my apologies for being late.
Oh, not a problem, not a problem. Yeah, I'm just going through some of the updates I did to the human organization deck. And then towards the end, I will talk about more of the functionality and then sort of the future, direction I wanted to take this in terms of expedition spaces and explorative spaces. So it's a good timing. So back to this slide. There are beneficiaries on both ends, right? So people who work in these silos up here, the employees or members, and the tool sets we're connecting them towards, and the contributors from the other silos that say, okay, here's a new tool, here's a new process, a new protocol we developed that works pretty well for our organization, right? Let me share that with the rest through the social ledger. This is all doable now because we have this common layer here, and not a centralized layer, right? A distributed layer where you own the piece that you share, and you can, add it, you can withdraw it, just as you wish to expand or collapse your space. So that becomes suddenly the notion of creating an ecosystem, right? Where I put the trees now in the background. So the trees are really symbolic for, that's the knowledge that grows inside your organization, right? And the trees have obviously the leaves and they're flourishing there, but they also have a root system, right? And this is obviously the important part of a tree is how do you connect that root system? Does it sit in some fertile soil? Does it have enough water, and so forth? So that to me is a great metaphor to say, hey, yes, we do have trees. We have these silos. We accept that. There are organizations out there. They have their own boundaries, of course. But remember, they also have a root system, right? That's connected, and they can be connected also in rhizomic ways. So, roots that go from here to here, right? So ways to actually find out that, whoops, there are other trees, in my serenity, and let's exchange some information here. So that picture is, to me, is very interesting in terms of how the social ledger operates. Thanks for joining, Jem. We're just going over the slides here, the changes I did, and then I want to get more into the functionality of the social ledger and the sort of the new piece I added in terms of the experience spaces. Okay, that's this new edition. There's one more, and then maybe I stop for a minute, see if you have any questions, concerns. This is, again, the same slide with these 4 organizations, right? And by the way, by organization, it doesn't have to be an entire organization, right? These silos exist within organizations too, right? So keep in mind that inside an organization, there might be units, groups, functions that are completely isolated from each other. And even within these, right, you have more. You go down the drain, you go down the rabbit hole, you have more and more of these silos. And the social ledger is something that operates at any of these levels. It really doesn't matter at what level you start to decide, to share and tap into the common knowledge of everyone else, right? To tap into this notion of a meta body. It really doesn't matter. So it could be just one single unit and inside one organization that says, yeah, let me tap into that and have my little group here. I create my own group here. Maybe that's private for now. And I just want to operate in that space and get a feeling for what it is and what kind of templates it provides, right? And then from there, step out and say, okay, maybe we're now part of a larger circle here that includes other people, right? That makes linkages between this and this circle here, that's much bigger than ours and has maybe much more experienced people on board that I want to start sharing information with. So that to me is a feature of the social ledger to say, hey, there is something called a meta body in there that you might at some point join. It's not that you're forced into some kind of new organization now, like an umbrella organization that tries to control things again. Going back to the idea of well, there's another future of way of working. This is it. And this is not that direction. It's more of a bottom-up meta body that exists suddenly, that you realize exists and is out there, and that you can tap into when you're ready to do so, right? When you're willing to open up your space more and trying to reach out to more people, right? Okay. Any questions so far? Am I going too fast, too slow?
Joachim, I have a sense of how the social ledger creates a new layer, which in some sense allows communications between these silos. And I think I see it across DiviDAO and Holochain and DigLife. And what's the other big one that I always forget the name of? But I don't think I quite understand technically how that works.
Yes, thanks, Gary. Good question. That's a couple of the next slides. We'll talk about the technical aspect from the UI perspective, because I've been very much into, how do we create a meaningful UI here based on the cards. And then from an architecture integration perspective, how does it work now actually building the next layer down, right? So the integration with the data layer and the integration with the other tool sets that we want to bring on board. So like a Mattermost is the obvious example, right? So how does the integration work with Mattermost to tie that closer to the social ledger space? I didn't answer that, Gary, but I want to get to that point.
That's fine. I just felt that I wanted to express that thought.
Sure. And to me, the easiest entrance to me is always the interface, right? So me as an end user, what would I see? What would I do? How would I interact with that system? That gets you, I think, a good understanding of where I want to take this. And then we can talk about some of the other layers that are deeper, that are necessary to make this work. Okay, let's move on. Yeah, question?
Joachim, I have, I guess I have a question or comment based on what you just said. So if there are project teams within organizations that are already using their existing tools, whether it be Microsoft Project or whatever else,
right?
Is it also the intention then that some version of Social Ledger will be able to work within existing corporate applications and platforms? So, I mean, maybe sort of integrate and sort of layer above those, or?
Super question. This is something actually Philip brought this up recently when I showed him this deck, and he, works in the consulting space of helping organizations to think this way, and of course they have their own tool sets and mammoth systems, ERP systems, employee, HR systems, communication platforms. That's a gigantic space. What I can see happening here is actually there are some ways to tap into their systems as well. So why not saying, they're using, say, an ERP system, or, let's keep it simple, more let's say a CRM system, right? Where they keep track of, their contact information. So why not saying, we would allow that organization to create an interface to their CRM application, right? And bring that portions of this into the social ledger, right? So there could be a card created that says, okay, here's an API that can reach into their CRM system, and that would indicate, say, here's some contacts, right, that certain people are working on in this organizational silo, right? And maybe they want to share that information now with others, either across another silo within their own organization, or if that's more open data, right, that they're willing to share, could be tapping into the wider network, the wider ecosystem of the social ledger. So what I want to say here, so a certain aspect of CRM systems are not closed to an organization, right? They can be opened up and brought into wider circulation here. And I think that's something I really want to explore with the future social ledger. Not only to say, here, there's some open source tool sets that we provide out of the box, right? But there can be more specific tool sets that the organization already uses, and that we can provide interfaces to as well.
I think it's worth mentioning here that, one of the main aspirations that we have now is to open up the APIs of all of these external tools so that end users can incorporate the capabilities of those services into the fabric of the social ledger, so that they're accessible through the social ledger, and we have the history of actions that they take, that they use these services, become part of the social ledger. For example, task support system, GitHub, and GitLab and Canboard are three targets that we might integrate with social ledger.
Right. That's great. Thanks, Jim. And what is also interesting, what I see happening is the whole API layers is beginning to standardize itself. You know, this new notion of, I don't know if you've looked into GraphQL, a way of redefining what the APIs actually are and making it much easier for developers to tap into APIs across a whole range of applications, right? That to me is a big trend that could really support, you know, the development of the social ledger here too. You know, if you imagine that there's a common layer, you know, that is known that we can tap into when we onboard another tool, you know, say some kind of CRM application already using GraphQL as the API standard. Great, we can just tap into that, you know, hook it up to our ecosystem, our network, and you know, define a few fields and a few, you know, data connections with the ledger, and off we go. You know, certainly there's a whole new possibility that can open up the more this kind of API layer standardizes. And I believe, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I may be jumping ahead of your sequence here, but since you mentioned GraphQL, I understand the reasons why we're doing Firebase and Firestore potentially because of the ease of hosted database services. The question, I guess, in my mind is why not a hosted graph database, which might give a more natural presentation and integration of data and more flexibility possibly in terms of as the data evolves? Or do you see that the Firebase, Firestore type of a structure is well enough for the foreseeable future of what the social ledger will do?
Yes and no. I haven't seen the latest slide on my sort of initial data architecture, data structure. I'm even thinking to not go the Firestore, Firebase route for the initial version. I'm thinking to tap into either GraphQL directly, if possible, or go through this direct data protocol thing via the Mongo database, you know, or any other NoSQL database that is outside the Google infrastructure as a starting point. But that's an architecture discussion. I'm not sure if we can get to that today, but I just wanted to mention that here on the sideline, that I do want to explore different options here to actually get into different ways of tapping into backends and what those are. Again, that goes back to Jim's notion. He brought this up very often. We got to be agnostic to the technology out there. And I see GraphQL as a great way to become agnostic to APIs. And if there are different databases out there that we want to utilize, become agnostic to that as well is great. You know, that's only supports this project. But let's move on, because there's so much to keep you up to date and give you an update on my thinking on this stuff. Remember this slide that had a few paths here, you know, going from top to the bottom here. So right now I see this in a different, more clearer view, let's say. When we talked about roped path, that's another concept that John Kelvin had brought up. So roped path is kind of a helping guide way for people to find their way through this changing landscape of how do we solve problems, right? How do we create these solution spaces to solve problems? And what the social ledger does, it leans very much into the notion of you have these, you know, if you take card as a metaphor, right? There's certain cards that work extremely well for you to move your project ahead. And as you go deeper into a project, right, you open up more and more spaces. And we'll get into the notion of what does the space actually mean here. But so what this visual wants to convey is there are spaces. Say you start with these 2, 4, 6, 8 cards here, right at the top. This dotted line here represents a single space, and there's one card that is extremely important to you, and that brings you to sort of like a portal almost to another space where you deep dive into a different context, right? So again, the dotted line is really the context of where you operate. So it's a deeper layer that is more focused, more concentrated, maybe has more people in that kind of layer than the space above it. And that goes down and down and down to other spaces that you even haven't explored yet. So this is very much to me a fractal structure. Where do I have this picture? I'll have that later. I'll show you what I mean by this fractal structure. But as you dive deeper and explore also parallel things, right? So cards on the horizontal layer that help you move your project further. You get closer to the bottom layer. By bottom layer, I mean here to a solution, a part of sense making that help you reach some kind of a breakthrough, right? Some kind of thinking that aligns the group well to move forward. And the other notion here is this dotted line here, meaning there are paths that are connected to other paths. This is not a strict tree structure, right? This is, what's that called, Jim? I forgot. Acyclic, no, oh, got it here. A directed acyclic graph. That's it. Okay. To get this right. So that means that children can have actually, more than one parent. So it's not a strict tree structure. To me, that's just simply says that cards can appear in multiple spaces. That's a fundamental design principle I want to apply here. If you do this, you have great ways to say not only do I jump from one space to another and recognize, hey, this is the same card that you guys been used in this space up here, right? But it also allows you to sort of jump from one context into another, right? Through say a portal. And I'll show you later what I mean by portal here, right? So this design principles, and we get this built into the social ledger, I think is very critical to that. Okay, let's move on. Let me see, where have we been? This is where we brought in the wallet. I think we showed and talked about that last time. This is again the same picture you just saw, but in a holonic context. So again, are these cards with some of the cards, the orange ones here, meaning there's a high value exchange happening. Sort of this is a good card. Use this card in your own context, right? So you can pull it over into this context, and you can start using it with other cards that you're using. And then cards can support, other cards. You can pull in this card into this, adjacent space because you're working in your own organization here. But you're free to say, hey, open it up to other spaces as well, right? So a space that's outside your context might benefit from whatever you created here in this context over here. Within this organization, or, you're reaching wider boundaries, you go out further into the network and say, hey, there's actually, kind of almost like public cards, public information that people can draw in and benefit from.
Joachim, you talked about independence of technology on the back end or the database layer and all that, whatever technology evolves or makes sense. Now on the user interface, can we think in the same terms? Because I'm thinking if somebody may be using this on a mobile phone. Also, there may be accessibility considerations. USI XML is a standard that allows you to think of or abstract out user interfaces in the target environments. So I'm wondering if something like that would be possible to have a sort of a middle layer where the presentation may be cards in one case, maybe voice in another, maybe a hierarchy or a kind of a directory hierarchy or something like that in another case, depending on whatever the user prefers or what the particular target environment might be. Any thought on that? Or
I would say not at this point. But certainly, if it helps to make the interface more agnostic, right, or structured, that's certainly something I do want to explore going forward. For now, I just want to get at something, the typical MVP thing, right? So a minimal viable product, minimal viable solution. So with given the minimal stakes here, so we're not getting into development mode for a year now before something can surface. What can we build today, right? That begins to sort of align our thinking here and begins to show some of the potential, ways of working in these spaces. That's the path I want to take now. And even, as far as going down the path of let's use the social ledger 2 to create the social ledger 2, right? So imagine if we can build this, create the spaces, actually work in these spaces to improve the space. And because we're there and we see what that actually is and feels and looks like and supports us or not, right? We would make changes accordingly, right? That to me is the thing, keep that as simple as possible with a lot of tools that are already out there, right? I don't want to recreate something. At the beginning of this conversation, we talked about Colony, and we talked about another tool that Philip had surfaced just recently called, what was that called? Atasha? What?
Akasha, I think.
Akasha. Which I looked into briefly, which actually tries to recreate an entire platform. It's like a full service stack of you join Akasha. What happens is we give you all the tools you need. We give you, but their own tools, right? That's the difference here. They give you their own chat, their own wallet, their own ways of setting up a contract, the ways how to share files. And then we'll add a lot more probably in the future, very much like Colony. So those become spaces, it's like their own little worlds where they say, okay, here are our tool sets and we control those tool sets. Of course, you have the freedom to operate in these things and we want to showcase how a new world looks like. But to me, it's not this open stack that I want to create with the social ledger, right? Because I want to benefit, I want to build on top of what people already built out there, right? So if you give an example, the obvious one is MetaMost, right? It's a great tool, great chat environment. It has so many benefits over using a commercial solution like Slack. Why not using that as the conversation tool, right? As the chat environment for getting started on connecting people, starting in these channels. Versus if we would recreate this inside the social ledger, right? As a whole software development piece that we would maintain and develop and release over time. And that's exactly what the Akasha guys and the Colony guys are doing. They're building these tools themselves. These platforms are now getting bigger and bigger and bigger because they have to respect the user feedback that they're receiving, and they have to adjust their platform according to that. That would make the social ledger a whole software development project only, right? Which I don't foresee here. This is again more about building bridges and using some standards to quickly onboard people and technologies and protocols, right? That then can be shared inside this platform.
Joachim, I think an important distinction with Akasha is it's purely decentralized. We're pulling together open source platforms such as Mattermost. They're not decentralized, are they? That's why they have to build new systems on that platform. So it's based on IPFS and the Ethereum.
Yes, and that's great you bring this up, John, because to me, the more of the distributed aspect that we can bring into the social ledger, I think the better we are off. I'm just at this stage, again, it's a minimum viable product thing. I'm not sure we're ready to tap into any of these distributed ledgers out there. I don't want to get into a platform that would cost us a lot of development, and we don't know where it's headed, right? Even with the folks like what they do with Ethereum, right? And the smart contracting thing. I don't know where this is going at this stage. I don't know where Holochain is going. I see ArtChain has some great progress there. Maybe that's the platform we want to sign up for and use that as our distributed backend.
The only true decentralized consensus is a consensus among distributed ledgers. And, you know, it's a heterogeneous world, and we're not building one of those worlds. We're connecting those worlds.
Yes.
I think Rao and I are more into the process orchestration out here when you talk about these trails or sequences of processes that lead to solutions, and discovering those and orchestrating them. You know, there may be some things that we haven't considered if we want to formally model the processes that are happening here. Like for Rolang to work properly, we need to have an undo operation for everything. So anything we do, we have to be able to undo. Well, not anything. Obviously, we're going to have state that's going to be persistent, but in general, we need reversibility of most things, except where it's absolutely necessary to move forward. And, you know, the idea that forking is natural. We can have a consensus independent of any thing that's considered a global consensus. There is really no such thing as global consensus. But we can have, there's many things we do have a consensus on, and we do share to you know, move forward. But it's, I mean, you know, this as a skeleton is really how we have to continue to look at it. And, you know, step one, I see enabling people in the bot ecosystem, connecting channels outside Mattermost, like Telegram and Discord, adding the currencies and the identity aspects, which is more of my focus at this point. But if we can get, I'm involved in so many communities now that all have great aspirations, and they're all almost aligned perfectly, and yet they're working independently. And, you know, here Joachim is coming up with something that could connect them. And I think it comes, you know, it's a piece of the puzzle that comes together with S7 and what ArtChain and a lot of the other communities are trying to do in terms of having a new way. Never mind. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to say is I really like the fact that, I mean, I don't think we should be wanting to develop something like a Mattermost or whatever. So if Akash's business model or development methodology is that, so maybe it's fine for them, because it's a lot more powerful to have something that can penetrate all existing systems, because you can get a mass adaptation much quicker. Because, you know, there's community in Telegram, there's community in Discord, there's community in Mattermost, whatever. So, and same with a whole bunch of different applications, whether they be enterprise applications or open source applications. There's huge communities in each of those. So I think to have built something that can penetrate kind of like a virus into all of those is the right model, is the scalable model, or you know, quick to market model. So I like that.
Great, thanks Raul. You just, you know, formulated the best value proposition I heard so far about the social ledger. That's it. Yes. That's why we would do this. And we want to be open, just the notion of last time we talked about currency, right? Folks like Akasha, they say, well, if you want to join us, you use our currency. Here's the currency. That's it. End of story. Versus we said, well, we're agnostic to currencies, right? You bring your own currency if you want, just like your ID, right? You bring your own ID into this space, and we handle that for you, right? We don't want to, drive you into a certain type of currency, a certain, way of identifying yourself. No, we try to be open to that, which of course raises a lot of the complexities here of this project. But I think we can push it down by saying, well, we start with one of them first, right? To get comfortable with how this actually works in our context. And then we expand it to more and more that we can connect to this ecosystem. Talking about ecosystems, hey, Christina, thank you for joining.
Good timing.
Yes, it is. I'm going through the slide deck here for the changes actually that I did in the first two parts of the deck. Now we're moving into the next section, so it's good timing. Let me see. So the next section is part 4 now, which is talking about the functionality of the system. And by that, I mean, don't look too much at the design of these cards, right? This already looks like a card design, obviously, but that's not the design I want to see out there when we build this thing. This is just a way for you to sort of wrap your head around a card-based interface. How that actually looks like can be, entirely different. Different buttons, more squares, different alignment, different menus, whatever it is. But what I wanted to convey here is sort of a basic feature set that a card-based interface could provide. Sort of the basic properties, basic attributes you see in an interface like that. So for that, I pull up, the card that you already saw in many of the earlier slide decks, which is to say, there's some kind of a title, there's some kind of a context menu, there's some kind of an icon representative, a picture, a photo that says, this is the card, this is the space we're talking about. There's also a notion of accessing a card or accessing the next layer that opens up through the card that I want to get into in the next couple of slides. There's also the notion of a primary action. So in terms of keeping it simple for users to say, hey, what am I doing here, right? And people who are not that involved here, they may see, okay, there's a single primary action, right? So that's the action. That's maybe the related action points I will get by taking this action, right? And at the bottom here, you see an important piece to me is the contributors of this action. So if you have a card here and you decide to join, to open, to edit, to write, whatever action it is that we're depicting here, we can actually compute kind of a score here. And this is not a ranking or something. This is just a participative score to say, hey, this user here is contributing about 80% to this particular card, right? This user here 10, another user here 10. And that is just a baseline calculation to say, hey, we can take this number and have now a foundation for eventually paying users back, right? So in case this turns into actual value for users, right? That service, that product, that process, protocol we create here turns into some valuable thing for anybody in the network here, in the ecosystem, and it becomes popular, we want to reward the people who were attached to that effort, right? And that's exactly what I wanted to show here, to say, hey, at any time we can see, let's say in this card here, 3 people were involved, and these were the contributions. They're comfortable with that because they've been working with this all along, right? So at any point in time, when we suddenly see value coming in, we can immediately see, okay, 80% goes to this person, 10% to this person, 10% to that person, right? And maybe a percentage to a higher collective, higher holonic structure that we're building into that. But that's the idea. So fundamentally, there's the part of identifying a card. What is this about? Tell me more about it. The way of accessing a card, and the way of figuring out who was actually part in creating and building this thing, right?
How does that interact with the role of the scribe? If somebody is just writing everything in, as this is not being used fluidly by everybody.
Yeah, so these kind of roles, I see them happening inside these spaces, and I'll get to that in a later slide, where we sort of bring what we know now from the social ledger, you know, the 4 worlds we created there, into that other space. But here it's more about you and what kind of actions you take on this card. It could be expanded to sort of a role-based access, but that would raise complexities enormously at this point. So I want to keep it, again, I don't know if you've heard that earlier, Christina. I want to keep sort of everything very simple, very flat at this point, and then sort of even try to use the social ledger 2 as a way to create the social ledger 2, right? So invite people who are participating, who are developing, who are creating new things for the social ledger into the space to make it better, right? To improve the space.
You would rely on each individual to actually be using and entering information on a card. So if you had somebody on the team who hadn't dove into the social ledger, had 3 hours a week to help with the network map, how do you record their activity without having them actually do this?
There could be, let's say they're sort of reviewers, of a network map, and what we would ask them is to visit the network map space that you created for your group, right? Say 4 or 5 people, and just check out the space. Become a member of the space, just like now you become a member of Circle, let's say, and access the content that we create through one of these cards. That's all what you would ask them to do, right? So you actually know that this person viewed it, or that person has added access to that document that's attached to this card. You would know, there's a certain editable attribution, edit attribution to that person, and you just record that. That's all at this stage, right? I don't want to go overboard and say what kind of edits, how long did that person edit, right? How much time did he or she spend on that? No, it's just recording to say, hey, he or she went through that space, looked at your proposal or wrote something in the proposal, and we record that. Hi, Philip. Wow, it's getting crowded here today. We started at 11 o'clock, so we're already way through the initial decks, but now we just started to go through here, section 4, which is talking about some of the functionality I wanted to embed here. So good timing. So that's the basic elements. Let's drill down on some of the finer, details of this card-based interface. One of them is what I call the access menu. So this is where we would say certain cards can be marked as public, as team, or as private. And to me, that doesn't exist in the social ledger right now. To me, this is an important piece to say once we know who you are, right? So you identify through the system, which you don't do right now, but you do identify. We know who you are, that you can then declare, okay, if you're an owner of a card, you can make it public. You can say only your team and your team space will have access to that, or you can make it private. Something where you want to create your own thing first before you share it to a broader audience. And you can use the social ledger for doing that, right? So you can pull out a tool, pull up a process, and use that before you decide to make that broader accessible.
I mean, just to comment on that, I don't know if the team maybe should be thought of as teams, because in some cases you might need to make something accessible to multiple teams, possibly. I don't know. There may be, if you're doing a product development, there may be a technical team and requirements or product management team. Both may need access to something. They may have different permissions. I don't know how that works, but something to think about over there, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. Yeah.
I think, we have domain, organization, and public, levels that I think should be included.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this is just a rough draft here. Don't see it as something that's the access control that we're going to embed in the system. No, it's just a rough draft. And just saying actually that there is some kind of an access control where you can restrict access to. I'm even thinking, not even to specific cards, because that would be way too much overhead. If there are hundreds of cards involved and you have to say for each card, okay, this is now accessible, this is not accessible. You probably add that to the concept of a space that I want to get into today too. And you say that space, just like in Mattermost, right? The space is private or team or it's public and anybody inside Mattermost can get access to that. So that's still, open discussion here. The one thing I wanted to highlight here is this activate thing. That to me is a function that says, okay, at some point, this is something you want to sort of give out to the wider collective, right? To the wider ecosystem and say, we created this tool, this service, this protocol. We want other people to use that. And maybe there's some kind of reward now going back towards the team who created that, right? That could be, it's a whole range of, ranging from a report that someone created, so it's like a written piece, towards functionality of the system itself, where they created their own connection, API connection to a tool, or whatever else it is. But the idea here is that you can activate a card and say, hey, now there's a certain value attached to that. And we recognize people want to use this protocol, tool, service, process. And we do want people to sort of give us back some of the rewards that we, the effort we put into this card. So that's a pathway towards that kind of thinking. Okay, so that's the.
So I'm a little bit confused on the activate. Is activate a signal that says, well, this is ready to use, or is it the enhance, be compensated, and so on and so forth, or is it a deployment indicator? What exactly is semantically, what is activate?
Great question, Raul. And I would say, if we'll go back to this one here called sharing and reusing. So a deployment indicator is a good way to put it, I would say. So this is a picture, some of these orange cards that are ready for deployment. So they can now be used, over here in this context, for example, right? Or they can be used even entirely outside your context, and people can tap into that and say, here, we created a service down here in this high activity cell, let's say, right? We worked on this service for a couple of months now, right? We used it a lot, it works pretty well here. Let me offer this service over here, sort of almost like a marketplace. Offer the service over here. And people can pull it in and say, okay, we're willing to try this out, but we do want to reward the people who were involved in this, right? So it's ready for deployment, it's ready for use here, and the reward goes right back to the creators of the card, which, again, it's the group of people with the percentages, the contribution percentages that are related to the card.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I guess once we begin to use it, we will know how that's going to work. But that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I know. That's the more it's taking shape, the more obvious the thing will become. Here's another card menu. The one here that says what's some basic functions around this. Right now in the social ledger, basically you only have a way to link from the object to whatever it links to. But of course, we do want to have the ability to edit this thing, to delete it, to copy it, to move it around, right? And also, and that to me is an important aspect, to create a subcard. And by subcard, I mean a card that's related to this card or opens up an entirely different space, a new space to work in. And I'll show you what that means in one of the later slides. Let's move on to the subcard a little bit more, right? So you can say that as a parent, this card here, this thing that you create here is getting too complex, right? So we need to break it down into smaller pieces, and for that, all you would do is sort of create another card that's now pointing to this parent here, right? And it can be a subcard that says, okay, there's now linked to this subcard is another contributor, right? So say a person that is now, because it's a child of this parent here, is contributing on a 10% level, right? Hypothetically. So you have the main card here, the parent, and you have 85% contributors here, let's say, but you decided to sort of branch out and say, this is too much. I need some design person in here who's working on some aspect of that. So you create a card, and then that design person would then declare that, yes, do that. Let me work on this, and this would mean it's a 10% contribution to the overall project. So suddenly the project breaks down into smaller pieces that you decide where you want to take it, right? Do you want to break it down into multiple levels, or you want to keep it in one aspect and embedded in this single card? So that's the idea of a subcard, and that idea actually took now much further with the idea of spaces that you can expand and go into deeper and deeper explorations of what you're actually doing there. But let's get to that. I want to go through the functionality first. Here's another piece which I call card box. So this is where some cards can become boxes that instantiate other cards, and you can think of this as one example is instantiated chat space. So say your team needs they've just met, they have no idea how to communicate, in these chat environments. They haven't done this before, right? And they draw into Slack, but they know the disadvantages they have using a Slack space. So they say, okay, what tools do you guys offer here? So obviously, Mattermost would be one of the choices here. And they can say, okay, let's instantiate a Mattermost chat space, right? So by using this kind of card, they would say, okay, we want to do that. And in the background, it would create either a new domain space in Mattermost or an entire new instance of Mattermost running on the server. So that kind of service is out of the box, and that would indicate, some of these orange cards you saw before. So some of these shared cards where these are ready, deployed services that you can tap into at any time by simply pulling up that card and saying, I want a new instance of a Mattermost space, or I want a new domain inside an existing Mattermost space, and start working in there. But this is not limited to, say a Mattermost space. There can be anything like a decision-making environment. Loomio can be a space where you create a new instance of a decision that you make on Loomio, or a new Loomio instance, right? Video calls, using, say, Zoom calls as a way to instantiate a new Zoom call, a new Zoom session. Note-taking applications where you need a space to write stuff down, to organize stuff, maybe something else, but Google Docs. Events, that need to be tracked, or method cards. So this is actually an example here of a method card. So by method card, I mean something like this here, right? Almost like a physical card where you have certain definitions of words that help the team think along certain lines, right? Introduce new concepts, new ideas that open up sort of a discussion space. And that to me is just another tool that you could introduce in a space like this, where I'm thinking of Brian Eno's Oblique Strategies cards, for example. Great way of introducing whole new concepts into a discussion that you can simply pull up to say, here's a card box with oblique strategies, and you click this button here, say, and it draws another card, an instance of that card. And then you can begin using that card and say, okay, let me respond to that. Let other people in my space respond to that card, see what they think in the moment, right? Think inside the context of what would that mean if we were to follow what the card says, or drill down further into what the idea and the meaning is behind the card. Okay, that's the card box. This is the attribution card. So this is again, this is the orangey card, meaning somebody has decided to deploy something, and you want to attribute that because you've used that in your project or your engagement, whatever it is that you're working on. And what I want to do with the social ledger is to say, have a simple way to attribute that. So there's a person who created this. That could be as simple as, a protocol, something like Ben wrote, how do you organize an open space, right? So it's a protocol that other people find interesting to use, and they would say, okay, we found the card, right? And we know here's Ben down here who created that protocol. We do want to attribute that to our project. This is as simple as saying, okay, we're going to link this as a related card to our current project, right? So it becomes part of a bigger card stack here. It says, okay, Ben's idea of an open protocol is now part of what we're doing, right? So he's always linked to this card, and people can get back to him and say, hey, that's Ben, that's great. Maybe we want to modify this and work with him on improving that protocol that he created, right? It's not, I want to make that distinction here, that it's not a contributor role, right? So just by using Ben's protocol, he's not becoming part of this particular project here. So that just means we want to attribute that and say, yes, we've used that protocol, and Ben was kind enough to share that with the rest of the collective, and we'd be able to draw it in and have people become aware of that this protocol exists, right? So that's the attribution card as another piece in this puzzle. Next one. Gosh, things are moving so fast. Let me think about what's that. So that's about the primary action button. So that's just to say we can assign some kind of not value. I just want to make it clear. This is not the value of the card. This is just a number that says, if you decide to edit something to this particular social object here, be that a Google document, some kind of a note-taking document where you write a couple of paragraphs, and we say this is going to give you sort of 100, whatever it is, coins, call it coins for now, right? So you as a card contributor, click on this button, declare yourself, okay, I'm editing this piece now, right? And I don't want to know how much you edit or how much time you spend to this, but I just want to know that you're part of this editing process. And that step now is recorded in the social ledger, right, as a sort of point contribution, based on which now we can calculate these sort of contribution levels, right? Again, that's all we want to do at this point, because it's only saying, well, there's Jim, Michael, and myself. We're part of editing this document. And all they did is to say, yes, I clicked on this button to open up the document, whatever is linked to this card. And we started doing our edits. And this has nothing to do with the value of this, right? So that to me was one of these great ideas that came out of this contributor accounting system, where you have to separate the stuff that we do, the activities and all the stuff that leads up to something that eventually will create value or not, right? Could be that there's no value and people recognize no value. But as soon as you do have people, sitting there and say, hey, this is a great process protocol tool set, I do want to reward this. That's the point where you create a reward. That's where monetary or coin flows, currency, call it currency flows, can now circle back to the originators of the protocol or service that was created, right? And this is also what's called in that article. It's kind of the memory of the system. So it actually remembers that these three people here were involved in doing that, right? And this is the difference. The thing I learned recently is our monetary system doesn't have a memory, right? You have your dollar bill, you pay. There's nothing attached to that bill, right? It's gone. There's a value exchange happening, a transaction between A and B. This is it. It's done, right? Versus here, you keep the memory of people who were involved in doing that thing, right? So the moment I say there's value and I'm using that for my own project, I still have these three people attached to that. They are there, right? So they exist, and if they're still part of that environment, they get rewarded for that, right? So that to me is sort of this new thinking in terms of, well, don't say it's gone, say keep it. Who was actually involved in that, and then who can actually start thinking about the service and say, hey, let's even improve this further, right? Because the moment you see that your card, your service is being used across a couple of collectives, that's a signal for you to say, hey, whoa, that's something that people really enjoy using. You know, we'll see some benefits in that. You do know who was involved, and you can now go back to these people, or the people can recognize that, of course, and say, hey, let's get together and improve that service even further. So that to me is all part of what I'm thinking in terms of the social ledger functionality. Okay, let's move on to transaction. So that's the other side, right? So when we have the part that says, let's create something together, the co-creation side, we have a few people working out some stuff. Now, at some point, it becomes a transaction, right? It becomes a service protocol, some object that is now ready for reuse, right? Roles terms, it's deployed, it's out there. So that becomes this shared card here. And then this changes to, you see, it now says $10, right? So some kind of currency that's now used in the system, right? And that currency is what you would sort of, it's kind of your buy button here to say, okay, I want to request that kind of service. I want to use that service. I become the card consumer now on this side, and it goes to the financial ledger, right? So that's just the finance side of things, where your account gets deducted and the other one gets increased, you know, based on the value that this card is associated with. Then the value flows back to the card contributors, right? So there are these three people here who actually created this kind of service, and they see the value, they see the benefit of people using and paying for that kind of service, right? So that is an aspect. I'm not sure if we can, I mean, it'd be great if we can have some kind of a wallet and currency embedded in early on in the social ledger too. But I'm not sure about the complexities yet of bringing that in there. I do see some ways, you know, Philip, I think you posted something recently with the tool you were using that, I think it was the Akasha thing too, right? Where they have that. Yes, yeah, we talked about that earlier. Where it becomes fairly easy to just integrate, you know, some kind of a currency and wallet into this kind of ecosystem. And the moment you have that available, great, you just plug it in, and you can now say, yeah, there is another process, you know, that goes through a consumer side of things with the financial ledger side of things, and contributors that are paid back, you know, from the other side of things, where you just worked on this together, right? And you were a contributor of this, and your actions have been recorded in the social ledger, right? So again, this is the social ledger side of things, versus it moves over into the financial ledger side of things, right? Okay, so that's this. Yeah.
The basic adage there is only collect. It's like only connect, only collect. If we collect the data at its primitive level, then it can be parsed into all these places as the ramifications emerge.
Great. Yeah. Only collect. That's what we want to do there. So now let's step back a little bit and, you know, get one of the bigger pictures. We looked at a single card, you know, single functionality that I want to embed inside the card. But if we zoom out a bit and say, okay, how do these views look like? You know, if you have a bunch of cards. So for this, the concept of a view that can be searched, filtered, right? So certain filters apply to, you see only certain services, you know, certain cards that relate to you, to your team, to your domain, or cards that can be tagged or sorted by certain types of cards, right? So cards that are related to the communication aspect of your work, cards that are related to your organization of files aspect of your work, right? So that's another way to bring this in. Then access control, of course, as a way to filter cards. So if you restrict a space to your team only and you don't see the other spaces, then that's a way to reduce the amount of cards that you see on your screen, obviously, right? Or some sorting orders, right? So you can say that, you know, there's some cards that are related to your team, your space, your aspect, other cards that maybe are only your cards. That's the only thing you want to see. You know, you want to work on your cards. You have your 4 or 5 things here that you go in there, you edit your document, you join a Zoom session, you create some more code for the social ledger. You want to make a drawing that explains the social ledger, right? So 4 or 5 aspects of your work, are represented through these cards here inside your space, and that's all I want to do, day in, day out. That's fine. Or you want to tap into, what I call these shared cards here. So these orangey thingies that are cards that are available that show you other stuff, that's happening in the network, right? So new protocols that came up. Maybe you have a view here that says today or this week, what did people come up with, right? So let me look at this. So people could have said, could have created some stuff that they shared during this week and say, okay, here's a new protocol. Here's a new link to an interesting article that got updated and that people shared, right? Let me take a look at this. Or a new document that someone posted, and let me read that. Click on the view button. Maybe circle back some currency to that person because I clicked on the view, or just say, depending on the person, if he just wanted to share it, just encourage people to view it so he or she can see how many views the person got by linking this article. So different ways of looking now at the views. Now let's take a look at the portal concept. Yeah. So portals. Cards, what I say here, can be seen as portals to open into deeper parts of the human organization. By that, I mean, you start at some entry point, right? So there's one card, I call it organization, right? Just label it. It could be something else, but I want to call it organization. That's most tangible, right? People are familiar with that expression of, body of people. That's the thing I wanted to create. So here's a card that says your first step, meaning you want to create a new organization in the social ledger. Then all you do is, there's a create button. Again, that's the primary button, so nothing to worry about all these other menu entries here. It says create. Click on that. What would this do is you see a form that says, okay, a simple form says adding your metadata. So something obviously, familiar with in all these other things that are out there where you fill out forms. But here it's not to submit something, but rather to create this next thing here, which is the card, right? A representative thing that says, here is the new organization that now wants to join the social ledger. So in this example, let's say ArtChain wants to join. Great. So ArtChain, here's a subtitle maybe for ArtChain, and then here's their logo. And here's now a button that says open. So that open thing can bring you to the ArtChain space, right? What does that mean? So that means it's another view deeper in the structure now. So you're going down a level. Say, give me this new context here of ArtChain, right? And it doesn't necessarily open into directly a chat space, right? Because ArtChain is more than just a chat space. To me, the chat space is just one aspect of that stuff that people are working on, but there's a lot more stuff. So I open up that new space and say, okay, the chat tool is part of this conversation. And that may bring you now on this level to a MetaMost space, right? Or a Discord space, right? Or maybe a Slack space, whatever they use. But you immediately see you're in the ArtChain context and you see that's where the conversation is happening, right? So you can recognize that. You can also see, again, who's actually in that space here. So a list of people who are working inside that space. So that to me is the notion of a portal, right? So you have a card that's just there for you to create something new, and then people can walk into that space and start working in it. Let me move on to now these portal spaces in the context again of the views. So it's very similar. You can group these cards together and say, okay, on the top level, you want to see all of the organizations that are part of the social ledger. Very easy. You go here and say, okay, I want to see the organizations first. And you see here's ArtChain, here's here's the NewMap folks, here's the Dig Life Collective, and they're all part of this. And they decided to open it up to say, hey, we're open for business, we're open for new members, right? So by clicking on this button, you can enter the space. You could say, well, maybe you've provide a membership fee actually to get into that space. A donation. We have that as an interim thing. So you can add that to this button, not a problem, right? But it's a portal, it's a gateway into that space, right? And you can browse through this, you can organize it by the different filters you want to apply to this, and then drill down into that space. Okay, so that's this view. Now, one more thing that I think would be helpful in navigating your way around these spaces. Something Jim will like, I'm pretty sure, because if I see his browsers, he loves tabs, right? He's the tab guy. So for Jim, I created this notion of, hey, what if we can customize these tabs? You create your own set of tabs that you're working throughout the day. So what happens is, let's say you are pretty much engaged in the editing content space. That's actually a channel we have now on Mattermost in the marketing domain. So you're engaged in the editing content space, you're engaged in the social ledger lab and in the Hivemind lab. So all you do is you visit that space the first time, right? You find the card, you find the space, you find the team, and there's this pin button here, right? This pin thingy. It's a very familiar UI component, right? So you click on that, and that would add a tab to your collection of tabs here, right? So you can organize those, you can click on the X thingy to delete it, right? But it gives you one view of the different spaces you're operating in throughout the day, right? So to me, this is like a space I would go here in the morning, say, okay, let me check out the marketing pieces here, what happened there, check out what's happening in the social ledger lab, let's go over to the Hivemind lab, right? Because I'm a member, because I'm engaged there and I want to contribute there, I have these tabs here. If not, I can just say I'm browsing around and looking into the different spaces and see what's happening there. That's a different mode of working. But I do want to reflect some of Jim's way of working as well. He has a set of tabs here. And probably for Jim, we need to make them multi-layered, stacked, so you can have a couple of 100 tabs here available for you, right? For all the different spaces you're visiting every day. But for the majority of users, I would envision there's only a couple of things that they really want to be engaged in. The rest, I'm not even touching. But you notice there's now another way of looking at the same content, in terms of meta maps and holonic maps. So let me drill down on that. What do I mean by that? You could say, the same card-based view that you had before, why not turning it into a meta map, right? So you could say that these nodes here in the meta map represent the different spaces, right? So, and they give you links back into that space here to see, hey, what's happening there. And not only that, they could also show you some related edges here, right? So this space is related to that, or there's an object that's related to this thing. So what meta maps could provide here is a simple way to organize this kind of view in whatever way you want to organize it, right? And I'm not even thinking in terms of a deep API integration at this point, right? To say all of the spaces are now built into the meta maps tool, and they update it themselves. Doesn't have to go that deep. I think it's enough to say we could provide this as a navigational tool, right? So as one way to create a meta map, and it could be your map too, right, that you're using or you're using with your team, right? To say, hey, these things are related, let's group them together, and here's a way to visually orient yourselves. Maybe even in the onboarding process, it can help you. And that's the great stuff you've been doing, Christina, right, with onboarding your members. That could be represented on this map, or if I go into the next one, in a Kumu map, same thing, right? Same story. So it's just a representation of or navigational way of saying, hey, let's move around these spaces. So just as an example, the stuff you've put together, Christina, in the past, this tremendous map of all these different organizations that are out there, right? Maybe they're becoming, part of the social ledger at some point, and then this actually becomes a map that represents people, processes, groups that are, now showing you who's doing what in the social ledger, right?
And just on the mapping front, I wouldn't think of Kumu and, well, I don't know how you get data into metamaps, but I wouldn't think of them as two different things. It's more like if you can tie that organizational metadata card, like the step where the organization creates metadata about its organization, if you can tie that to the data structure for the map, then that can be peeled off of the social ledger and create an addition to the JSON file for the map that we're putting into an RDF format anyway. So it'll be, you can pull it out into Kumu, into, you know, different tools you're using that read graph database stuff. So
Yes, you're right. Yeah, and what I want to see here is sort of a deeper and deeper integration with these kind of tools, right? So let's say if Kumu at some point has an API, and then we can actually automatically create these objects in Kumu, you know, if a new object appears in the social ledger, right? And vice versa. That's the thing with GraphQL that I find super fascinating, is you can actually say if Kumu has something new created, we can report back to the social ledger and create that same object we created in there, right? So it's a two link. It's a bidirectional stream here of information data exchange here that I find really valuable to explore and look into the way, you know, the more we build into this ecosystem here.
Once it gets further along, I think it would be interesting to, I don't know if you ever saw Philip Pridmore-Brown's software or got to talk to him about the graph database that has the natural language processing pipeline. It's like Kumu on steroids. Kumu breaks at about 10,000 nodes in one project, and his can hold billions, you know, really robust. And you can point it at, like, you know, he pointed it at the climate change website for the state of California and was able to pull all of the different climate legislation bills that came up as they came up as nodes in his software. So yeah, he is also trying to figure out slowly whether it's going to be open sourced or not with his company. So at some point it would be good to have.
Could you put the link to that software that you're talking about in the chat?
No, it was created for the Department of Defense for getting ahead of the blast in trying to address terror threats, and I'm working with it. I'm happy to, like, set up a demo. We're actually going to try and record a 5-minute demo video, but right now it's not open source. It's not anywhere. And his company is trying to figure out what they want to do with it. So, you know, ping me later and I can make sure that you get a demo. And I have a login that I can log into, so I could do a screen share and show you really quickly what it is.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Okay, let's move on to a couple of other slides here. And again, these are just representations, right? Different views on the same stuff. And this is our familiar Holonic, you know, circle chart, or packing circle chart that allows you to drill down into the different spaces, right? So this could be the same representation that we use today in the social ledger for something like this, right? Where you see you're editing content, you know, it's one space that's somewhere in, you know, Dig Live marketing, somewhere down there, right? Just a little circle here. And you can move around here and click on this circle when you get there, and then that brings you to the other view that says, okay, here are the different activities that are happening inside the circle, right? So a different way of navigation. That's all I see here right now. So navigation through meta maps, through Holonic maps, through Kumu maps, if you want to maintain that. And you could take this even further, and that's more hypothetical. This is saying, I'm not sure if you're familiar with fitness landscapes. So fitness landscapes is a mathematical way of representing importance of certain activities in a network. So these bubbles here, see them as say spaces that have a certain activity reach a certain threshold, and they climb sort of higher on this map here. So you can see this as teams sort of slowly circling around a mountain and climbing up higher and higher to come up with better and better solutions, right? And the purpose of the fitness landscape is to show where are the best solutions, right? Because we don't know how the landscape will look like. We can only, it's try and error, right? It's moving up a little bit and say, okay, this solution is an improvement over that solution. And you can actually visualize that by tapping into the data that we create inside these social objects. So that to me is another area I would like to explore later. Let's get to the notion of place making. So I've been playing around with that a lot in the past when I was running these knowledge expeditions. What comes up in a lot of the organizational design work too is creating these safe spaces, creating spaces where you feel sort of at home, where you like to return to, right? That kind of reflects of who you are, what you work on, and it's almost like an ambience, right? So here's just an example of this temple in China, which by the way I was able to visit last summer. Beautiful place right in the middle of these dunes here, and it's a space, right? And you could invite people to that space, and it immediately creates sort of an ambience here.
Okay, I've got to step in. That's Photoshop, right?
Okay,
come on.
Step in.
Have you seen the size of the dune on the left? Don't give me that. That's not real, is it?
Oh, it is real. It exists. Yes.
How does it not get buried when the dunes move?
It's like in a special ditch here, whatever, geological sink here that protects it. It even has a lake. You see that thing here? That's real water. It's a lake there. It's called the Crescent Lake. So because it looks like a half moon, right? So there's a beautiful crescent lake inside that. I mean, it's like
I think it's a bunch of monks holding the sand off.
Okay, I'll show a picture of me.
It's a Photoshop.
Show a picture of you.
Good. Yeah, I could share that. Okay. Again, this is about placemaking, right? So this is the concept I want to take now into part 5 of this deck, which I call immersive experiences. So what does that mean? An immersive experience is something where you and your group dive into a world where you always want to return to. That sort of is the current state of your work, right? Sort of the current state of thinking of your team. It's the home base. It's where you want to evolve and dive deeper into the matter, into the subject matter, right? And one of the metaphors I've used at Seniors is the notion of a base camp. So a base camp is if you're familiar with treks to the Mount Everest, this is the starting base. It's about 5,000 feet high, meters high, and it's where these expeditions are launched from, right? So you have all these tents there, and you get all the equipment served up there, and from there you go, up the mountain here, up Mount Everest on these enormous, strenuous treks. But to me, this metaphor works pretty well for what we're doing here, because here is the same notion of, you see this base camp as a space, right? This is one of the spaces which could represent, let's say, a channel in Mattermost, right? But it's more than that, because it's where your work surfaces, as one of the cards here that says, here's our chat space for the base camp. Here's another one for the tool we are going to use to go on that expedition, right? So the next thing I wanted to bring in here, which is presence. Once you're in that space, you can actually very easily say, okay, who's currently present in the space? So if Gary is here and Christina are here, they can see themselves as avatars, and they can start to interact with each other. They could open up a peer-to-peer session, say, and have a quick video call. Or they could have a quick chat in this space, say, anyone here, let's have a chat. So that becomes sort of the home base of quickly touch basing with everyone, right, who's currently in this space. And then throughout the work day, if you want to continue working on this, expand that space, right? Add new cards, add new work. Yeah, go ahead. Quick
question. There's been a couple of discussions, either with a palette or, some sort of availability palette. I got laughed out of the room when I liked the actual spaces of Sococo where you could go into an office and shut the door and nobody would bother you, or they would knock on the door and you could say, no, I'm not available, versus being able to just like come in and have a conversation like you would in an office, like walk to the water cooler. But it's great. I mean, in terms of like these spaces can get noisy and different people have different protocols. It's great to be able to know, like, I've set up my availability as busy today. So unless it's really urgent, people won't bug me with random questions. Or just, to chat, to say hi. But maybe on another day I'm less busy and I'm available to do some of that sort of social bonding stuff, and I leave my door open or whatever. So some sort of availability indicator would be great.
Sure. That's to me what I look at from the functionality, and it's totally doable, because that already exists out there, right? So it's very easy to embed that into a platform, and then it's just another attribute to say, hey, yes, you're available or not, then you show up here. But to me, it's important to say, hey, this is one context out of many I'm working on throughout the day, right? This is my identity here. I'm here now. I'm willing to work or answer questions that you have and start building more inside the space, right? So this is one aspect of launching these expeditions, and the other one is the onboarding aspect, because you kind of guide them now on the path to in that instance of we want to climb that mountain, right? So and Basecamp is a great metaphor for that, because now you can help people to get started, getting to know their skill sets, having their climbing gear ready, whatever that means. That could be gear in terms of, well, if we're climbing up Social Ledger 2 here, we need some programming skills, right? Here's the platform we are using. Here's the tool sets we're using to build this thing, right? And it's a space where you can declare your roles and intentions, right? So you can bring all of this into just by looking at that space and starting to have a conversation with people. So the onboarding becomes, well, there's some breadcrumbs we can lay behind. Once a team goes on an expedition, well, they move on to the next space, right? So this is where I wanted to show you here. There's a fractal nature of this whole thing. If you see the base camp here at the center, of this fractal chart, expeditions can launch into all kinds of directions, right? So new projects, new thingies are launched, and they move on to other spaces that now drive deeper into the development stage of whatever project it is. They also branch out, meaning the adjacent spaces that group things together, right? So you go into a space that has some research, work around. We're looking at certain aspects of the story we're developing. Some research needed to be done. Well, an adjacent space is a research space, and you go in there, visit that space, and similar thing like at Basecamp, but now in a research space, and you explore things there and build out there. More research gets done, more links get added, more cards get added, and that expands, right? But the notion is there's one main branch here, and that to me is an important part of this metaphor. Is you move on this main branch while you go deeper into the matter subject, and eventually end up at a place where, well, you reach the top of the mountain. This is as far as you want to go, or it's time to return, right, to Basecamp and share some of these findings with the rest of the team. But that can be now. If you bring that to scale, just think about if people would take that metaphor and say, okay, we have our own expeditions, right? We go somewhere, into some other parts of the world, and want to use that as a metaphor, that they're comfortable with, that they've used maybe in the past even, or physical places they've gathered together, right? That's our base camp. Let me create that and invite people to that space. Make it as homey as possible, right? Make the ambience there, and the people are there, the conversations are there. That's the space. And then from there, we're going to move on to other aspects of the project. So that to me is a very powerful metaphor that I love to bring into the social ledger work. Yes, sorry. Go ahead.
Just No, it's okay. No, I'm loving it. I was just looking at the dendrite metaphor and wondering actually if perchance there's two ways up Everest and we might meet at the top. In other words, that the branches occasionally might meet at confluence that might be significant. And if I was looking for another metaphor, or is it an analogy? I always forget the difference between the two. It would be Hebbian theory, which is the theory of the brain that things that fire together wire together. And the sequences of cards that come together to form this dendritic path might be patterns that play out again and again and again. I just wanted to seed that to see if there's any way that might be identifiable.
Cool. Yep. Thanks, Philip. Let me actually show you one of the first part you just talked about. That's something I wanted to bring into the design of the social ledger, which is called a directed acyclic graph. What that means is you can actually connect different pathways here, and children can have multiple parents in this environment, so they can jump from one aspect or the other, or merge. You see here, like you go down a path here, it's through different spaces, and they can merge again, right? So cards can reappear in multiple places. They also connect you to multiple places, right? So this gives you a whole different rhizomic view of this, right? So it's not a strict tree structure, right, where everything is organized, you know, down, go down, go down, and you're in that structure, right? That's right, Christina, exactly. It's a thing where, you know, actually it brings you to another space, and that's this directed acyclic graph that I do want to bring into the social ledger, so you can have
Perfect.
that.
I joined after that slide. My apologies. But
no, it's nice. A great question. Okay, so lastly, we're reaching the top of the hour here. I want to show you, in the context of the social ledger too now, the development, how would this look like actually if we create this? And you know, I said earlier, you know, if we can use the social ledger to create the social ledger, we could then say, okay, let's establish Basecamp, right? So what does that mean if we establish Basecamp? That means we create a space, you know, we open up that space, we make a space where we're now starting to see some of the elements that we're developing in action, right? They're actually appearing in that space in a very simple, primitive format initially, right? So it's nothing, you know, complicated here. But it's space that has an ambience, that has a certain, you know, connection to the different, you know, data points that we're collecting here. And it's beginning to take shape also in the terms of the different frameworks we are using, right? So there's the web framework, there's the interface, like Bootstrap, you know, UI framework. There's a template framework. There's some server configurations that are taking shape. You know, there's some deployment processes, some app management, identity management, beginnings of a development journal. You know, a journal is something, you know, that's a good metaphor, because I like to sort of to overlap between, you know, the expedition, you know, that you're on, where you typically would write a journal. You know, want to document some of the things you learn, and what you do in this actual space. So there could be a development journal that's shared with the team, that people who join the team can read and follow along, right? So sort of what's going on in this project. Same with the gear, right? I mentioned that earlier. You go on an expedition, you need some good gear for that, right? So what is your map? What is your compass? What is your backpack? What's inside your backpack? That we want to provide people, you know, at Basecamp, to say, hey, we're going on this journey. Here's the stuff that we already decided to, you know, anchor in and start using, and you can join us and use the same gear, right? It's already there. So that's in terms of you know, sort of the basic configuration on the server side. Yeah, Christina, you have a question?
At the risk of sounding like a broken record, this is very dev-centric, and I don't really see, as a Muggle, where I would hop in, easily get a picture of what's going on, and make a little bit of a contribution, and not be overwhelmed with the language of DevOps.
Yes, I totally agree with that, Christina. And this is actually a map of how I see the initial development happening for the social ledger. This is not the thing that other people would see when
right. But that's sort of my point that Laura and I have been making over and over. That in the initial development, people who are non-devs, especially women and people of color, don't get listened to, and the structure of software has implications socially.
Right.
So I would like some way to have input and be listened to without having to become a dev.
Yes. Yeah. You see, it's it's a question I've been struggling with too. At what point do we want to invite people to actually get their feedback and see how they feel about using these kind of spaces, right? Do we need some minimum set of functionality? Because otherwise it's way too confusing, If you see stuff that's halfway developed and that's breaking, that has still to be debugged, you don't want end users in that space.
But what if you go outside of the sort of standard tech, like get an MVP and then show it to people in tests and go and do what you think and from the feedback? What if you asked sort of a little bit more how people work social questions? Had some way to answer some of the functionality questions without showing anybody a UI. A lot of people in the collective have 5 hours a week or something like that, and they have a lot to give, but they don't have a lot of time to learn. So how can we keep them engaged and activate that expertise that is there and attract more, which we've been not great at?
I see this as multiple perspectives, and certainly this slide is not about the user perspective at all. The onboarding, from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4 is something that the social ledger doesn't address directly, because it is controlled by norms, not by software. It isn't software that controls how people work together so much as or even a specific interface, although the card interface is emphasized here. Joachim said he's not so much about the API ecosystem, and certainly, users don't care too much about the API ecosystem yet. My own view of what we're doing and what we're developing in our work studies is a replacement for Zapier, where we can create cards and have them connected to our APIs easily, and we don't have to be developers. Where we define the functionality of these cards in an evolutionary way. We create one in a team, and other teams use it. We share, and these are it's simply this scaffolding of tools where we define rules for what function on this card gives 10 tokens to Rao, or whatever rules are there. We're looking at enabling processes which essentially attract contracts to every card, to every entity, is a behavioral thing rather than a static object that
Yeah, I mean, basically, there is a whole, to Christina's point, there's a whole set of cards, perhaps, or a base camps that relate to skills and requirements and goals and things like that, where people can say, here are the skills I have, here are the goals I have, and here is what I think is needed to help me move forward, right? I mean, so as a community, if there's a place where people can state those, and somehow we can make sense of those and have a consensus process that would then say, okay, here is how things should be developed or designed, or at least identify projects. Some of that may be social ledger functionality related, some may be something else. But I think that would be what could engage people more with the social ledger initially, because like Christina says, a lot of them may be intimidated or maybe may find it not friendly to engage with it. But if we are engaging with what they have to say and can say in that context, I think we may be able to bring them into using it.
You're muted.
The skills map is like what everybody wants for a network map for a team, but it's actually really, really hard to build because getting the right categories of how to define, like I can write, I can speak English, do I need to map that? Everybody can write, you know, there's some people with certain writing skills. It's a really big job. I was thinking more along the lines of like, can the social ledger lab, rather than just inviting people in, can you come up with something that explores the norms by which people are working successfully already, and then see what that means for the structure of the social ledger, rather than building this thing and then saying we need to create these norms in teams so that people use it.
Right. Yeah, that's right, Christina. To me, I see the social ledger as really not part of the Digital Life Collective anymore. This goes beyond that. That was a good kickstarting.
It's the meta tool.
Yes, right. And I'm already, what I'm doing now is to share that presentation, this deck here, with other folks, right? So you saw John Calvin, for example. He has a huge conversation community space, right? And he's deep into collaborative sense making, into investigative journalism, right? Into education. So I want him to reflect on that and say, hey, how would something like this apply for your context, right? And he's already, very eager to say, hey, what's my role here? What can I do? And I want to build more and more of these kind of bridges here, right, to these other folks. You saw the other guys in the beginning of the presentation, like John Husp and Harold Jackie, right? So that's the next group of people I want to reach out to see how does that make sense in an organizational context for them, stuff they've been working on for years and years to bring people together and working in new ways in organizations, that can help them out. So I'm asking them, what kind of bridges can you build, using the social ledger? So to me, it's slowly now spreading out this thing and see where the applications are in the field, right? Way beyond the Digital Life Collective. I mean, Digital Life is a great, sort of client to this to say, hey, you're one of the, early onboarding groups here with some of these channels that, of course, welcome to use the social ledger for that. But I want to go way beyond that and see how we can make sense out of this in a broader context, right? And to your point also, Christina, as early as possible, right now this is a deck, nothing else, right? And there's a social ledger trial, to sort of prototype some of the early concepts and see how people can actually use this stuff in an environment like Mattermost, right? But I do want to bring this a lot further to say, well, at some point, this is not a deck, this is a prototype they can use, right? So then I want people to actually go in there and create spaces, right? And have their own environment. And then we start supporting these spaces, right? And then expand from there. Anyway, folks, we're way on over time here. And Jim has something to share, okay. You're mute.
I was struck with the S7 user story here on synergetic co-creation, and you know the notion that if people come in, they're on a journey, okay, and it's their journey, and you know we're just facilitating it along, and you know they come into the lounge, okay, this is your base camp, okay, and they settle in and share. Well, I'm thinking, well, what do they share? You know, what would they like to share? You know, what brought you here? How do, you know, engaging them in co-creation from where they're coming from and what they do. And then, you know, the self-locator, locate yourself, your currencies and hold-ons, you know, what can you do? What do you like to do? What do you want to do? Okay, and this sort of defines the working is playing is learning. What you can do, what you like to do, and what you want to do. I just thought this was a very interesting approach to the steps in an individual journey toward co-creation.
That's cool. Thanks, Jim. Really, very much on point. You know, that's great. See, they have their own map, right? Who is to say, you know, they have to use our map, right? Of course, they're going to create their own journey, right? What I want to do with the social ledger is the ability for teams to create these journeys, right? And to go on the journey and have the right set of tools and templates at their fingertips. So they don't have to worry about that part because we provide some of this. Alrighty, okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone. Journey to be continued, right? We'll come back another time.
Thanks, mate. Really appreciate it. Lovely way to start the evening.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
See you later.
Take care. See you.
Bye.